First Baptist Daysel. How are y'all this evening? Who's excited to be at church tonight? Okay, will you stand with us and sing these awesome songs that everybody knows? I want to hear you sing it out. Y'all sound good. All right. Hopefully this goes because my lyrics just stopped. Okay, ready? Y'all know this one. Sing it out with me. I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene. and my sorrows, and he made them his very own. He bore the burden to Calvary and suffered and died alone. We're singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. Okay, y'all sing this out. And with the ransomed in glory, his face I at last shall see. It will be my joy through the ages to sing of his love for me. We're singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. Let me hear your voices. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. Is my Savior's love for me. Y'all sound beautiful. Okay, you can take a seat.
All right, very good. Good to see you tonight. I'm glad that you're here. If you're watching online, welcome to our Bible study. If you would, turn in your Bibles tonight to the book of Leviticus. And I've got this here somewhere. Chapter 11. We're going to begin in chapter 11. I know that Chris got you a part of the way through chapter 10, where Aaron's sons, two of them were killed. Do you remember that? Were you here for that? They did what they were not supposed to do, and they didn't get a slap on the wrist. God killed them, and but Aaron had two other sons that God then used to take the place of the first two, and then they got in a little disagreement with Moses about some regulations, and it all got solved there in chapter 10. But I'll let you read that on your own. Tonight we're going to begin in chapter 11. We're going to go through 11 through 13 with some highlights here and there. But most of chapter 11 I'm going to go ahead and read to you. I want to remind you, whether you're watching online or you're here tonight, first of all, I'm glad that you're here. It is always a privilege to get to read God's Word. I want you to think of that because we're in Leviticus, and it is easy for you, and it's easy for me to say, well, you know, this is kind of technical kind of thing, but God has some interesting information here for us always. It's all God's Word, and it's all important. So we're going to glean from that tonight what God would want us to know. that should be our prayer as we look at his word. Leviticus chapter 11, we're going to begin in verse 1, and I will probably read the entire chapter all the way through. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Say to the Israelites, of all the animals that live on the land, these are the ones that you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a split hoof completely divided that chews the cud." Cud? These are some that only chew the cud. There are some that only chew the cud or have a split hoof, but you must not eat them. In other words, they have to have both, not one or the other. Those are the two requirements. They have to chew the cud, and they have to have a split hoof. And we'll talk about why in a little bit. So if they have one but not the other, you can't eat half of it. It's either all or nothing. The camel, though it chews the cud, and by the way, he gives examples. I love this. The camel, though it chews the cud, does not have a split hoof. It is ceremonially unclean for you. The coney, though it chews the cud, does not have a split hoof. It is unclean for you. Does anybody have a different translation of the word coney? Okay, the what? The rock badger? Wow. Okay, I bet that's probably what that is. I don't know. Maybe that was a big animal back in the day. But I think we're safe. When it says coney, I'm thinking of a... which, by the way, would also have been unclean. Verse 6, the rabbit, though it chews the cud, does not have a split hoof. Doesn't have a hoof at all. It is unclean for you. And the pig, though it has a split hoof, completely divided, does not chew the cud. It's unclean for you. You must not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you. Of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales. But all creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among the swarming things or among the other living creatures in the water, you are to detest. And since you are to detest them, you must not eat their meat, and you must detest their carcasses. Anything living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be detestable to you. These are the birds that you are to detest and not eat because they are detestable. The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, any kind of black kite, any kind of raven, the horned owl. Now, let me stop right there. I don't know why he just didn't say no owls, but he gives them a whole list. The horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the stork, and any kind of heron, the hoopoe, that bird, and the bat, which if you'll notice, the bat's not actually a bird, but they put it in the bird stack there, in the bird paragraph. All flying insects that walk on all fours are to be detestable to you. There are, however, some winged creatures that walk on all fours that you may eat. Those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground, which means what? Grasshoppers. Grasshoppers got the green light. So come this summer. Now, I think it was Chris that suggested to me tonight that I start off by popping a couple of grasshoppers in my mouth. You'd remember that, and it's clean. But I said, it's not the season. We don't have any grasshoppers. Maybe next time. So, but grasshoppers. Where was I? Verse 22. Of these you may eat any kind of locust, katydid, cricket, or grasshopper. But all other winged creatures that have 4 legs you are to detest. You will make yourselves unclean by these. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean until evening. Whoever picks up one of their carcasses must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean till evening. Every animal that has a split hoof, not completely divided, or that does not chew the cud, is unclean for you. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them will be unclean. Of all the animals that walk on all fours, those that walk on their paws are unclean for you. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean until evening. Anyone who picks up their carcasses must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean till evening. They are unclean for you. Verse 29, of the animals that move about on the ground, these are unclean for you. The weasel, the rat, any kind of great lizard, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the wall lizard, the skink, and the chameleon. Again, I don't know why you didn't just say, don't eat lizards. But he lists them. Verse 31, of all those that move along the ground, these are unclean for you. Whoever touches them when they are dead will be unclean till evening. When one of them dies and falls on something, the article, whatever its use, will be unclean, whether it is made of wood, cloth, hide, or sackcloth. Put it in, excuse me, just trying to sneeze. Okay, where was I? It will be, verse 33, if one of them falls into a clay pot, everything in it will be unclean, and you must break the pot. Any food that could be eaten but has water on it from such a pot is unclean, and any liquid that could be drunk from it is unclean. Anything that one of their carcasses falls on becomes unclean. An oven or cooking pot must be broken up. They are unclean. Could you get me a Kleenex, sweetie? If you can find one. A spring, however, or a cistern for collecting water remains clean, but anyone who touches one of these carcasses is unclean. If a carcass falls on any seeds that are to be planted, they remain clean. But if water has been put on the seed and a carcass falls on it, it is unclean for you. Isn't that interesting? Verse 39, if an animal that you are allowed to eat dies, thank you very much. I don't know, maybe she went back to the house. All right, very good. Where was I? If an animal that you're allowed to eat dies, anyone who touches the carcass will be unclean. So if you touch the carcass of an unclean animal, you're unclean. If you touch the carcass of a clean animal, you're unclean. In other words, thank you, sweetie. In other words, don't touch a carcass, it's unclean. Now, can you tell me an example of somebody in the Old Testament touched a carcass? Samson. Yeah, the guy who was supposed to be extra clean, he was a Nazarite. Nazarite means, it's from the word Nazir, the Hebrew word Nazir, which means to be separate. And so, of all people, especially a Nazarite, would never touch a dead body. But remember, there was, of course, he made the dead body. He tore the lion apart, came back some weeks later, and there was a beehive in there with some honey. And so he ate the honey, and of course the honey was unclean, and the carcass was unclean. In verse 40, anyone who eats some of the carcass must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean till evening. Anyone who picks up the carcass must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean till evening. Every creature that moves about on the ground is detestable. It's not to be eaten. You're not to eat any creature that moves around on the ground, whether it moves on its belly or walks on all fours or on many feet. It is detestable. Do not defile yourselves by any of these creatures. Don't make yourselves unclean by means of them or be made unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves around the ground. I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore be holy because I am holy. These are the regulations concerning animals, birds, every living thing that moves in the water, and every creature that moves about on the ground. You must distinguish between the unclean and the clean, because living creatures that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten. All right, now let me ask you, why does God care about what they eat? Why have all these regulations? To see if they'll follow them? Okay. All right. Certainly obedience is a big part of it. I'm sorry? Okay, one of the commentaries that I read talked quite a bit about that, the health issue. And we're going to see that some more in a minute. We'll talk about that. Somebody else? Okay. All right. You're on the right track. So why not? Why not keep doing what they've always done?
They're to be set apart.
All right, there's to be set apart. And people will say, well, what's the deal? Why not? Why not have, I kept mentioning last time, I kept talking about bacon. Why not have some pork chops? Why not a little bacon with your eggs? What's wrong with that? Well, God is distinguishing his people from everybody else. There are things that they are required to do that are not required at other places. He wants there to be a distinction between his people and the people where anything goes. All right. It's not the only reason, but I think it's part of it.
At this point in history, there was nothing different between them and everybody else.
Yes, and they
That had to be built over time.
very true. They came out of a culture. If you're watching online, he said that there wasn't a lot to distinguish them from everybody else. They came out of a culture, the Egyptians, where you're right, anything went. And so there was no dietary regulation in that sense. Now back to the health things. There are people that still will keep the Old Testament Levitical code, and they'll live by it. They won't eat pork, et cetera, because they swear by it that these regulations are healthy. But honestly, strangely, in our 21st century culture, most of this is considered unclean that they could eat. That is, they're not allowed. I mean, they're allowed to eat meat, and they eat lots of meat. Bulls, beef, lamb, goats. They ate a lot of that. So they ate meat. They ate fish all the time. Peter was a fisherman, for example. And Jesus made fish appear out of thin air. When he fed the multitudes, they were just fish with scales on them. So for those who are non-meat eaters, the vegetarians or the vegans who don't eat meat, they would find these regulations to not be strict enough. They couldn't eat bats, for example, and there was no, the Impossible Bat Burger. There was a plant-based simulated bat. They didn't have the ability to do that, and we don't either, by the way, very well. But the general feeling, though, that you get when you read it is God is trying to protect them from, not just from disease, but from animals who might be more susceptible to disease. Let me put it that way. For example, we know that bats carry disease. In fact, we just had a little pandemic. Do you remember that? Yeah. That pandemic started where? Wuhan. But what was there? It was an infected bat and some other kind of animal, they think. But depending on what theory that you read. But isn't that interesting? All of these centuries later, we have a worldwide pandemic that may not have happened if it weren't for the fact that people were eating bats in China. Isn't that interesting? Oh, bird flu, swine flu, yes, right. Well, I'm okay. It's the bats. Just no bats. We'll be all right. This is from the Bible Exposition Commentary. It says 32 times in Leviticus 11, you find the word unclean. 32 times in this chapter. And 10 times you find the word abomination. What God says is unclean must be an abomination in our eyes. This is from Isaiah 5:20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. The first step toward disobedience is often reclassifying sin and making it look acceptable instead of abominable. And so what somebody said a while ago is, I think the first thing that somebody said is this was a step of obedience. Whatever God told them to do, that's what they should do. And they're not to question it. They're not to think, well, as for me and my house, we're going to eat the pork chops. They don't question it. They just do what God tells them to do. And so this writer talks about that the first step toward a disobedience is often reclassifying sin and making it look acceptable. We live in a culture that does that. He says, for example, God said that the tree in the midst of the garden was off limits to the man and the woman, but Eve, quote, saw that the tree was good for food. Now, the tree wasn't good for food because God had told her not to do it. It was a sin of disobedience. And so she took the fruit. God said that all the spoils of Jericho were under divine restriction and that were not to be touched by the Jewish soldiers in Joshua chapter 6. But Achan revised that classification and took some of the spoil. It cost him his life. Samuel told King Saul to slay all the Amalekites and their flocks and herds, but the king kept Agag alive and kept the best of the sheep and the oxen, and he claimed it was going to keep it to give it to the Lord. But it was disobedient. Saul reclassified what God had said was abominable and thought this would make it acceptable, but his folly caused him to lose his kingdom and his life. Today we live in a society that rejects moral absolutes and promotes a fluid morality that isn't morality at all. Like the people described in the book of Judges, everybody is doing what is right in their own eyes. But society's reclassifying of sin hasn't changed anything. God still calls sin an abomination and still judges it. Now, the fact that this had to do with food, and we have been freed from the law of dietary regulations in the Old Testament, it doesn't change the fact that we are to be obedient to God. We have a New Testament and book after book after book, chapter after chapter that instruct us on what is obedient and what is disobedient. And while we don't have to worry so much about what we eat in terms of cleanliness and uncleanliness anymore, we do and are expected to be obedient to God. All right, any comments about Leviticus chapter 11 before we move on? All right, Leviticus chapter 12. Honey, would you close that door over there for me? Thank you. Leviticus chapter 12. Leviticus chapter 12 is all about being pregnant, giving birth, and female issues about clean and unclean. You are most welcome to read that on your own time. I'm going to Leviticus chapter 13, and it's a short chapter, chapter 12, but you can read that. Leviticus chapter 13, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when anyone has a swelling or a rash, you're going to wish I hadn't read this one, by the way. It just goes downhill. But strangely, this chapter may well apply to our time right here, right now in 2021, better than any chapter in the Bible. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when anyone has a swelling or a rash or a bright spot on his skin that may become an infectious skin disease, he must be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons who is a priest. Now, I don't know, maybe Aaron and his sons are thinking, great. Wow, did I sign up for this? Because they're going to be busy. It's 3 people to check out everybody. Verse 3, the priest is to examine the sore on his skin, and if the hair on the sore or in the sore has turned white, and the sore appears to be more than skin deep, it is an infectious skin disease. When the priest examines him, he shall pronounce him ceremonially unclean. If the spot on his skin is white, but does not appear to be more than skin deep, and the hair on it has not turned white, the priest is to put the infected person in isolation for 7 days. Isn't that interesting? They're put in quarantine for 7 days. Verse 5, on the 7th day, the priest is to examine him, and if he sees that the sore is unchanging and has not spread in the skin, he's to keep him in isolation another 7 days. And so if it's not gotten any worse, he puts him in isolation for a total of how long? 14 days, just like the CDC has told us. How about that? 3,000 years later, we're still doing what's in Leviticus. How about that? Verse 6, on the 7th day, the priest is to examine him again, and if the sore is faded and has not spread in the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only a rash. The man must wash his clothes, and he'll be clean. But if the rash does spread in his skin after he has shown himself to the priest to be pronounced clean, he must appear before the priest again. The priest is to examine him, and if the rash is spread in the skin, he shall pronounce him unclean. It's an infectious disease. When anyone has an infectious skin disease, he must be brought to the priest. The priest is to examine him, and if there is a white swelling in the skin that has turned the hair white, and if there is raw flesh on the swelling, raw flesh meaning red or, like that, inflamed. If there's raw flesh in the swelling, it's a chronic skin disease, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He's not to put him in isolation because he's already unclean. There's no reason to put him in quarantine because I already know he's got it. Does that make sense? So it moves it to another level. Verse 12. If the disease breaks out all over his skin, and so far as the priest can see, it covers all the skin as the infected person from head to foot, the priest is to examine him, and if the disease has covered his whole body, he shall pronounce that person what? Clean. Well, if you're going to get it good. Since it has all turned white, he's clean. The white's good, red bad. That's what they're basically saying. Verse 14. But whenever raw flesh appears on him, that's red, he will be unclean. When the priest sees the raw flesh, he shall pronounce him unclean. The raw flesh is unclean, he has an infectious disease. Should the raw flesh change and turn white, he must go to the priest. The priest is to examine him, and if the sores have turned white, the priest shall pronounce the infected person clean, then he'll be clean. Wow, okay. Well, that was a lot of fun, wasn't it? All right, I want you to share with me your take on this chapter, and I'll say a few words, and then we're going to close for tonight. What do you think that God might be saying to us in this chapter?
Pay attention to your body.
All right, pay attention to your body, okay?
Don't ignore it.
That's
I couldn't ignore it there.
don't let it go. Yeah.
People would be saying, no, go, poor priest.
Yes, poor priest. That was my first thought, is the priests turn into the doctors. Did you notice what it doesn't say? It doesn't say, all right, take these pills for this rash, those pills for that disease. He doesn't say go to your pharmacy. He doesn't say go to a doctor and get some advice. He just says go to the priest and isolate. That was their strategy. Now, they did talk about cleanliness. You want to take a bath, stay clean. But it's interesting, how they responded is very different than how we respond, except for in this pandemic, isolation. That part is the same. All right, anything else that you noticed?
Seems very vague with the amount of skin disorders that are out there.
Right. Well,
It's very vague in that,
okay.
what's covered, what's not.
He says it seems very vague about what's covered and what's not, given all the skin diseases out there. Now, if you're in the middle of Sinai, 3,000 years ago, you're pretty isolated already. So the amount of skin diseases that they could get out there, especially those that are contagious, is going to be way more limited than us. In fact, as you know, last year when this outbreak actually happened, had this outbreak happened, had this what turned into a pandemic, had COVID happened 50 years ago, it very probably would have been isolated from most of the countries. But we live in a day and age where everybody goes everywhere all the time. And so it just took a matter of a day for people to fly from China to here, or from China to somewhere else, and a few more days later to every country on the planet. So pandemics were caused by exposure. And so they were pretty isolated. So the amount of diseases that they were talking about here were probably very few, because they were susceptible to very few because they were so isolated. One good advantage of living out in the middle of nowhere. All right, but it's a good comment. It's a good thought. Now today, you're right. I mean, this would need to be a lot more specific. There are infectious disease books you can buy if you're going to be a nursing student, Don't look at them, it's awful. But this is probably the very first one in history, and you got to start somewhere. All right, anything else that you might have noticed? Yes?
What would they have done in Egypt? So, they've come to Egypt and he's getting them trained.
What would they have done in Egypt? I can tell you that's a good question, and secondly, I don't have the answer to that question. I don't know what they would have done in Egypt, but I can tell you, based on their sorcerers and their advisors, there are things that they would have done in Egypt, both in terms of spiritual matters, of sacrificing to their gods, their false gods, Isis or Ra or whatever god they wanted to worship down there. Those are two of the main ones. But they probably did have some basic medicine or chemicals or lotions and that sort of thing that they holistic type things that they would have used. But it's an interesting thought. And you can do the math. Whatever diseases that the Israelites have, they got it in Egypt. Yeah. So, all right, any other thing? Now, the basic meat regulations. You and I, we live in an interesting culture because we don't have to worry about any of this most of the time because we run down to Walmart and we look at the expiration date. I have to put a date on it. And if it's in the date, you eat it. If it's out of the date, you don't eat it. We have all of these regulations and requirements. Now, Cherry, my beautiful, sweet wife, came from a country where, in fact, she lived a life to where they ate a lot more like the Israelites ate. And I don't think she's had bat, but she's eaten grasshoppers. She'll tell you how to roast them, which grasshoppers are clean. I don't know why they're clean. I wouldn't have made them clean, but they're clean. Although some of our Texas grasshoppers are definitely big enough to eat, to feed a whole family. But they would roast them over a fire. You take the hoppers off and the wings, and then you put them on a stick or something, and then roast them over the fire like popcorn. How about that? That's one way to get your protein. Do what? Yes, there is no chocolate fountain in Leviticus. Do what? Oh, bread them, deep fry them, and put some cheddar cheese on them. I'll try it. No, doesn't mention any of that. You're thinking like a Texan now. There you go. If you're watching online, we're coming up with the recipes. So anyway, all right. With that, concerning whether back to the skin diseases. Concerning whether the blemish was only skin deep or it went deeper, one writer mentioned this story. He says, in the 18th century England, if you were convicted for stealing, the judge would order the authorities to chop off your right hand. If you were convicted a second time, they would cut off the left hand. He says, I recall reading about a pickpocket who lost both hands, but managed to succeed in his career of being a pickpocket because he perfected picking pockets with his teeth. Even if the authorities had pulled all his teeth, it wouldn't have solved the problem because sin is deeper than the skin. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 15, verse 19, for out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. These are what make man unclean. And so he's having them do all these dietary regulations, in part because they didn't want to be physically unclean and get disease and get sick and die. And it makes sense in a lot of respects. But also, this is, I won't say a test from God, but this is God laying down his rules and saying, you need to obey me, even though you don't fully understand why. When Eve bit into that fruit, she didn't fully understand why God would make such a regulation. But God understood, and it was her job to obey and not to consider the why. When Achan took some of that plunder and didn't understand why he couldn't do that. Didn't make any sense. They weren't going to use it. The enemy was dead. God understood. And it wasn't for him to ask why. It was for him to obey God. We ask why all the time, whether we realize it or not. I find myself asking God why. Why this and why that? Or feeling that way. Or, again, we may not verbalize it in our prayers to God, or we may. When things happen that we don't like or don't go our way, we ask why. It is not for us so much to worry about why. It's a part of trust that we simply obey. Trust and obey. And that is as hard to do now as it was 3,000 years ago with the Israelites. All right, anything else? All right, how about that? I'm going to get you out early tonight. Look in your prayer list for the week. This is